Head now to a wave. There's a wave in Sudan tonight. After nearly 30 years in power, Omar Al Bashir has been ousted as president of Sudan. This is after wananchi walisimama na kusema tumetosheka. It all started in December when the price of bread, I think, tripled. And now the protest started. It started in small towns and gradually grew.
Yeah,
and
and
gradually grew to other parts of the country, and they did not relent. And finally, after months, Omar Al Bashir is no longer president of Sudan. Yvonne, I know you really want to talk about this.
I really do, because tonight for me, the hero of all of this is the lady, you say her name so well.
Allah.
Allah Salah. And I'd like us to show that video of this woman who's become the icon of that wave in Sudan, leading the protest. And in many ways, her clothing is very symbolic. She's wearing white, which they talk about the workers. Earrings. I'm hoping we can sort of play that video. Look at her. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the reason, or at least one of them, that's Omar Al Bashir. Maybe we can listen to just a little bit of that, because it was just powerful. What she was able to do. All right. So she is an engineering and architecture student. Now, even as we talk about this lady, I'd like to just point out that there's a lot of similarities between this and the Arab Spring of 2011. So first of all, a lot of young people were involved, social media. As you can see from that video, many people have their phones up and they're holding that. And of course, this went viral. And it's all about the youth and that ticking time bomb. The same thing that happened in Arabia. Unemployment, the high rate of that. And a lot of these young people who are unable,
even Egypt Square,
with the Tahrir Square, a lot of them unable to relate with the aging dictatorships.
It's true.
This is two down now. Omar
That is very important to say about
For me, I see a different picture. I mean, obviously, this is refreshing, and to the extent that it helps to bring down the cloud of dictatorship. Because I think what happens to some of these guys, I mean, however good you are as a president, when you have been in power for 30 years, something begins to give, and you begin to think that the country owes you something. You begin to think that the country cannot go on without you. But I am worried about where this is going. Because you see, if you talk about the Arab Spring, it's perhaps only Tunisia that you can talk about and say, well, they got into this transition and then transition into a sort of a democratic sort of system where there is an election cycle that is now becoming a bit more regular. But all the other places, if you look at Libya, it is in a mess. If you look at Syria, there was this protracted civil war that some people say it has ended, but that country is not what it used to be. If you look at Iraq and all these places, there was this excitement that came with the so-called Arab Spring, that this was going to usher in a democratic dispensation in the Arab world, which never happened. So even for Sudan to see this Awad Ibn Auf taking over in charge of this transitional government and saying, restore democracy in 2 years. I mean, I'm not holding my breath. And so for me, that is where a lot of those revolutions are hijacked by people who are not part of them in the first place, but who see that the people basically have overpowered the government, and so they pose as allies of the people, but then they subvert.
But
because they're talking about that,
just add to that, because that is why in Algeria, the protests continued even after Bouteflika left, because they're not just seeking toppling a leader.
So they have a better outcome because they have an election in July.
Because what they actually want is a total overhaul of the system, which is also why the Sudanese today are also saying, we don't want the military.
They're actually angry about it, Linus. What Yvonne has just said, I'll give you a minute. Exactly what you mentioned, and you talked about it also. Awad Mohammed Ibn Auf, that's the guy. He said they're going to take over for about 2 years. But then now, we had these thousands of people on the streets, and they're really happy that this guy's finally left. But after this announcement, they're saying, no, we can. The ones who announced the protest, they're saying, no, we cannot have this. These guys have to leave now, ende kabisa kabisa, because these same people are actually in Omar Al Bashir's government. We don't want any of them.
I mean, this guy was
Unfortunately, the protesters will have to bear with the way history works. It works in a way that they'll have to make do with moderates or the likable faces within what Omar Al Bashir created. He was in office for 29 years. That's a very long time. In that period, you create a lot of levels of government. You create a lot of people that then become influential position holders. If you look at the Zimbabwe example, they had to turn to a vice president of Mugabe and call it a revolution. You look at Egypt, Al-Sisi was a senior commander of the army in the Mubarak government. You look at a country like even Kenya. What did we have to do and pretend it was a revolution? We picked Moi's vice president of 12 years, or is it 10 years? Mwai Kibaki. And we went to the streets as if Nelson Mandela has arrived in Kenya.
Even Algeria, Linus, the gentleman who there is a General Ahmed Gaid Salah. He was part of Bouteflika's government for a very long time.
Yes, and why that system works that way is because you still need the exiting team, because they hold so much. Those commanders, including the guy ordering the arrest of Omar Al Bashir, owe him a lot in terms of who they are. They were created by Omar Hassan Al Bashir. But to just the broader point of what this means, Joe and I watched a documentary called Mobutu. You can put that in French.
Le roi de Zaire.
Yeah, King of Zaire. And you see Mobutu reacting to the exit of Nicolae Ceausescu of Romania. The face was that face of horror.
It was shaken.
Because it immediately sends a message to him. You two have been in power for that long. And there's something these autocrats miss. It's not about their misrule. It's not about the way they mismanage government. It's not even about corruption and making their families rich. It's about overstaying the welcome. You serve for only as long as there are not enough brave people to say and tell you, stop, this is the end.
In fact,
Linus, when you talk about overstaying your welcome, I'll interrupt you for a minute. You can talk about someone like Fidel Castro, who in history, he's the one leader who stayed in power for the longest time. It's actually 49 years. You know, when you're talking, people may think, ni hawa viongozi tu wa Kiafrika ambao wanakaa wataki kutoka. The longest serving president in history is Fidel Castro, was in power for 49 years. Taiwan's president, 47 years until 1975. Gaddafi was in power for 42 years. Omar Bongo in Gabon, 41 years until he died. Currently, as it stands, the world's longest-serving president is Equatorial Guinea's president, who's been in power for 39 years, since 1979.
I just want to point out something about Fidel Castro.
There are differences.
There are different systems.
I know, because of
right there. They make it very clear from the beginning, this is a revolution. They don't change the constitution, remove term limits. Another time they are changing their age. You know, they do a lot of...
It's clear from the word go. Same can be said from Lee Kuan Yew, who basically brought a revolution in Singapore. And the Singapore that we see today and the Singapore of 40 years ago, it's like day and night, because this is someone who takes over and everybody's clear that this is where we are going. But here are people who pretend. I mean, even for this Bouteflika guy, I mean, the guy comes up with this fifth term. What are you talking about?
In fact, I'm looking at
the same example.
I'm looking at it in this context. The message that probably is coming from Sudan is that most of these guys who have held on to power for too long, probably they need to start thinking about their stay. You also don't want to be kicked out unceremoniously like Bashir has. So probably you need to start thinking about an exit plan, even for whatever reason, because there's some
transition.
There's some people who were born and they found a president. They have grown, given birth to children who have become big, and they are still seeing the same president. So probably there's a reason, there's a problem there. And sometimes longevity in power does not translate to quality leadership. I mean, look at some of the countries that are headed by people who have been in power for too long. You cannot say because these guys have been in power for too long, their countries have developed or they're doing so well. Probably there's a reason why they need to start thinking about transition. I'm looking at the Equatorial Guinea guy, Obiang. Look at Paul Biya of Cameroon. Look at Yoweri Museveni of Uganda. Idris Deby of Chad, Isaias Afewerki.
They're watching Sudan very
then-
closely.
Yes.
And you
Very
say-
sure they don't like the news.
And you say
Yeah.
something very important, Francis, about prepare kuondoka, because I still see in my eyes when Saddam Hussein was ousted and also Muammar Gaddafi,
yes.
how terrible it was that walikuwa natolewa katika hali hiyo. It's something that
Embarrassing.
it's very embarrassing. And
I mean,
think
for Bashir, they said
Yes.
these people walked in the small hours of the morning and say, guy, you have no alternative but
Ondoka tu.
but go. And the guy was leading that. He's defense minister, but the guy has turned against him and saying, hey, you really have to go. And the guy
But
said,
this is an
Okay.
interesting scenario because it will be like Bashir has left but hasn't left. So, like Linus is saying, the people of Sudan probably will have to live with some of these situations that are historical in nature, that there are remnants of that administration that you're trying to get rid of that will remain there. So you will not necessarily have a complete overhaul, but to some extent, at least there's some change that is symbolic.
and the message that the people can get angry and actually rise up.
watu
Right,
wanakasirika
and
na
we're
wana-
seeing some of the reactions
But even then,
coming through.
before you go
Yeah.
to the reactions, one more. In Kenya, when we had our protests here,
Yes.
I'm seeing people say, we as Kenyans, we are a bit hypocritical because when people raised questions and they went to the streets, they were said to be economic saboteurs. They were said to be making the country ungovernable. Probably, as Kenyans, what we are celebrating Sudan people have done, maybe we need to have some self-introspection. What happens when our people raise questions about governance and how they are treated and how we treat them as people? Probably we need to be a bit more candid in how we deal with some of these things.
Right, and some of the reactions, we just seen the US government urging the Sudanese military to include civilians in the administration, and they've also, the State Department is also saying that the 2-year transition period is too long. This is likely to be the part of the conversation going forward. We are going to hear from the AU the usual story
Yes.
that no, military stay in the barracks. I hold a different view.
And the Russians,
also
who
will
are
the ICC
allies
be coming?
of South Sudan,
Yeah.
of Sudan itself, have already said that this is unconstitutional. Yes, you mentioned about the ICC and the fact that Omar Al Bashir is wanted for atrocities committed in Darfur.
And more importantly, will the AU still back him up?
Very
Now he's no
interesting.
longer a leader, so nothing in it for them, but let's wait and
This
see.
is one of the big news stories
Robert
in
is
the world.
very, very impatient on the earpiece.